Welcome to Lesson 15 of How to Understand Quranic Grammar series. In this lesson, we continue what we started in Lesson 14, which is discussing the particles of Nasb. Last lesson, we learned that the particles of Nasb can be used with nouns and also with verbs. And in the previous lesson, we studied the particles that can be used with nouns. And in this lesson, we tackle the second group, which is the particles that come before verbs. So let's get started. The Nasb particles that can be used before verbs are an, lan, kay, hatta, and li. So the first question is, can we use these particles with any kind of verb? Well, no, that is not possible. Let's first remember what kind of verbs are there to know which one we'll be using it with. As we've learned in this lesson, there are three types of Arabic verbs: past verbs or al-fi'l al-madi, present verbs or al-fi'l al-mudari', and the imperative form or fi'l al-amr. Past verbs are always in Nasb state, so they always have fatha as case ending. So that's why we say kataba with fatha at the end of the verb, because this verb is in the past tense. And for the imperative verbs, they are always in jazm state, which means that they always have sukoon at the end of them. Like when we say urkud, so the dad at the end of the verb has sukoon. But present verbs are in rafa state, which means that normally they would have dhamma at the end of the verb, like the verb tada'u with dhamma at the end of the verb. Particles of nasb can only and exclusively occur before present verbs, and they will never be used with past or imperative verbs. And when any of the particles of nasb come before any present verb, they will affect them in two ways. First, present verbs will end with fatha instead of dhamma. Notice here the verb tada'u is normally used with dhamma at its end. وَتَضَعُ كُلُّ ذَاتِ حَمْلٍ حَمْلَهَا. Let's see how it will be different when the same verb was preceded by the particle حَتَّى. حَتَّى تَضَعَ الْحَرْبُ أَوْزَارَهَا. So here the verb تَضَعُ became تَضَعَ because it was preceded by hatta. So that was the first effect on present verbs. The second effect can only be observed on present verbs that are in dual or plural form, which, as you should know by now, both of them end with noon, like the verb yu'minun, as an example for plural verb, or yaf'alan, as an example for a dual verb. When such verbs are preceded by a nasb particle, they will lose the noon at the end of the verb, like what we see in this ayah. أَفَتَطْمَعُونَ أَن يُؤْمِنُوا لَكُمْ. So the original form of this verb is يُؤْمِنُونَ. But because it was preceded by the particle an, we cannot say ayyu'minun. That would not be correct. So the noon at the end of the verb was omitted. And here I have to say that this is not the only reason why the present verbs lose their noon at the end. There are other reasons that I'll be explaining in future lessons, insha'Allah. Remember, verbs that end with feminine noon, or in Arabic we call it noon and niswa, do not follow this rule, like what we see in this example. فليس عليهن جناح أن يضعن ثيابهن. So here the verb يضعن ends with noon and niswa, and it was preceded by the particle an, and we still see the noon at the end of the verb. So any of these 5 particles will cause any present verb to have either of these effects to their case endings. Let's dive deeper into the meaning of these particles and see some more examples using these 5 particles. And the first one is an, which means that. And it is actually a particle that can be used with nouns too. So we have studied a version of it before. This one occurs before present verbs, like in these examples. كبر مقتا عند الله أن تقولوا ما لا تفعلون. We notice here that both of these verbs are present verbs, but they have different endings. The difference happens because one is preceded by an, and the other was not preceded by a nasb particle. The one that was preceded by a nasb particle has lost its noon. So, تقولوا is used instead of تقولون. But the other verb at the end of the ayah has noon normally because it is a present verb that is in the plural form. One more example. وَأَنفِقُوا مِمَّا رَزَقْنَاكُم مِّن قَبْلِ أَن يَأْتِيَ أَحَدَكُمُ الْمَوْتُ. So here we see the verb يَأْتِي with fatha at the end of it because it was preceded by an. أَن يَأْتِيَ. The next particle is لَن. And len means will not. So when it is added to a present verb, the combination will refer to a future negative. Like in this example. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا لَن تُغْنِيَ عَنْهُمْ أَمْوَالُهُمْ. So the verb تُغْني is a present verb. But when len is added before it, the combination of the verb and the nasb particle will refer to the future. And naturally, the present verb will have fatha at the end of it. The next particle is kay. The word kay means so that. And though it is a separate particle that can be used separately, in the Quran, you will not see it used separately, but rather in combination with the particle li. So it becomes likay, but that will not affect its function or how it affects the verb that comes after it, like in these examples. لكي لا يكون على المؤمنين حرج. And this combination with likay that is followed by la, sometimes we see it separated like that, but in other instances we see it as one word, like in this example. لكي لا يكون عليك حرج. And in both cases it means the same thing and it has the same effect on the verb that comes after it, as we can see. The next particle is حتى. Hatta is a very flexible particle in Arabic, but in the Quran, it is mostly used with the meaning of until, and that is what we see in these examples. وَمَا يُعَلِّمَانِ مِنْ أَحَدٍ حَتَّى يَقُولَا إِنَّمَا نَحْنُ فِتْنَةٌ. And in this example, we see يقولا, and it is a present verb in the dual form that has lost its noon at the end of it. So the original form here يقولان. But in this ayah, حتى يقولا, without the noon at the end of the verb. فاعفوا واصفحوا حتى يأتي الله بأمره. And here is a present verb that has fatha at the end of it because of hatta. And here it is important to know that hatta could also be used as a jar particle. But in the Quran, it was used only once with that function. And that was mentioned in Surah Al-Qadr. سلام هي حتى مطلع الفجر. And obviously we see it here used as a particle of jar because the word after it has kasra. Other than this example, all other uses of hatta in the Quran belong to the nasb particle. The last particle is li, and this specific particle is called in Arabic lam ta'lil, which translates to the lam of explanation, and it is used to provide a reason for what was mentioned before. In other words, it means in order to or for, like what we see in these examples. وَأَنزَلَ مَعَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ بِالْحَقِّ لِيَحْكُمَ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. One more example. وَرَفَعْنَا بَعْضَهُمْ فَوْقَ بَعْضٍ دَرَجَاتٍ لِيَتَّخِذَ بَعْضُهُمْ بَعْضًا سُخْرِيًّا. And in both of these examples, we see that the present verb that had lam al-ta'lil attached to it, both of them ended with fatha, because that is the effect of the particle of nasb. So in conclusion, the particles of nasb that are used before verbs are 5. An, len, kay, hatta, and lam al-ta'lil. They turn the ending of the present verb from dhamma into fatha, and the plural and dual verbs ending with noon will lose their noon at the end of the verb. Thanks for watching. If you want to start your journey to learn the tajweed of the Quran, you can click on this link. And if you want to understand the Quran in Arabic, then you should click on that link. And finally, I hope you've learned something new today, and I will see you next time.